Danny the Champion of the World by Roald Dahl. Read by Timothy West. When I was 4 months old, my mother died suddenly, and my father was left to look after me all by himself. I had no brothers or sisters. So all through my boyhood, from the age of 4 months onward, there were just the two of us, my father and me. We lived in an old gypsy caravan behind a filling station. My father owned the filling station and the caravan and a small field behind, but that was about all he owned in the world. It was a very small filling station, on a small country road, surrounded by fields and woody hills. While I was still a baby, my father washed me and fed me and changed my nappies and did all the millions of other things a mother normally does for her child. That is not an easy task for a man, especially when he has to earn his living at the same time by repairing motorcar engines and serving customers with petrol. But my father didn't seem to mind. I think that all the love he had felt for my mother when she was alive, he now lavished on me. During my early years, I never had a moment's unhappiness or illness. Once I was old enough, I spent all day in the workshop, helping my father with the cars. The filling station itself had only 2 pumps. There was a wooden shed behind the pumps that served as an office. There was nothing in the office except an old table and a cash register to put the money into. It was one of those where you pressed a button and a bell rang and the drawer shot out with a terrific bang. I used to love that. The square brick building to the right of the office was the workshop. My father built that himself with loving care, and it was the only really solid thing in the place. "We are engineers, you and I," he used to say to me. "We earn our living by repairing engines, and we can't do good work in a rotten workshop." It was a fine workshop, big enough to take 1 car comfortably, and leave plenty of room round the sides for working. It had a telephone so that customers could arrange to bring their cars in for repair. The caravan was our house and our home. It was a real old gypsy wagon with big wheels and fine patterns painted all over it in yellow and red and blue. My father said it was at least 150 years old. Many gypsy children, he said, had been born in it and had grown up within its wooden walls. With a horse to pull it, the old caravan must have wandered for thousands of miles along the roads and lanes of England. But now its wanderings were over. And because the wooden spokes in the wheels were beginning to rot, my father had propped it up underneath with bricks. There was only 1 room in the caravan, and it wasn't much bigger than a fair-sized modern bathroom. It was a narrow room, the shape of the caravan itself, and against the back wall were 2 bunk beds, one above the other. The top one was my father's, the bottom one mine. Although we had electric lights in the workshop, we were not allowed to have them in the caravan. The electricity people said it was unsafe to put wires into something as old and rickety as that. So we got our heat and light in much the same way as the gypsies had done years ago. There was a wood-burning stove with a chimney which went up through the roof, and this kept us warm in winter. There was a paraffin burner on which to boil a kettle or cook a stew, and there was a paraffin lamp hanging from the ceiling. When I needed a bath, my father would heat a kettle of water and pour it into a basin. Then he would strip me naked and scrub me all over, standing up. This, I think, got me just as clean as if I were washed in a bath, probably cleaner because I didn't finish up sitting in my own dirty water. For furniture, we had 2 chairs and a small table, and those, apart from a tiny chest of drawers, were all the home comforts we possessed. They were all we needed. The lavatory was a funny little wooden hut standing in the field some way behind the caravan. It was fine in summertime, but I can tell you that sitting out there on a snowy day in winter was like sitting in a fridge. Immediately behind the caravan was an old apple tree. It bore lovely apples that ripened in the middle of September, and you could go on picking them for the next 4 or 5 weeks. Some of the boughs of the tree hung right over the caravan, and when the wind blew the apples down in the night, they often landed on our roof. I would hear them going thump, thump, thump above my head as I lay in my bunk, but those noises never frightened me because I knew exactly what was making them. I really loved living in the gypsy caravan. I loved it especially in the evenings when I was tucked up in my bunk and my father was telling me stories. The paraffin lamp was turned low, and I could see lumps of wood glowing red hot in the old stove. And wonderful it was to be lying there snug and warm in my bunk in that little room. Most wonderful of all was the feeling that when I went to sleep, my father would still be there, very close to me, sitting in his chair by the fire or lying in the bunk above my own. My father, without the slightest doubt, was the most marvellous and exciting father any boy ever had. You might think, if you didn't know him well, that he was a stern and serious man. He wasn't. He was actually a wildly funny person. What made him appear so serious was the fact that he never smiled with his mouth. He did it all with his eyes. He had brilliant blue eyes, and when he thought of something funny, his eyes would flash, and if you looked carefully, you could actually see a tiny little golden spark dancing in the middle of each eye. I was glad my father was an eye smiler. It meant he never gave me a fake smile, because it's impossible to make your eyes twinkle if you aren't feeling twinkly yourself. A mouth smile is different. You can fake a mouth smile any time you want, simply by moving your lips. I've also learned that a real mouth smile always has an eye smile to go with it, so watch out, I say, when someone smiles at you with his mouth but the eyes stay the same. It's sure to be bogus. My father was not what you would call an educated man, and I doubt if he'd read 20 books in his life, but he was a marvellous storyteller. He used to make up a bedtime story for me every single night, and the best ones were turned into serials and went on for many nights running. One of them, which must have gone on for at least 50 nights, was about an enormous fellow called the Big Friendly Giant, or the BFG for short. The BFG was 3 times as tall as an ordinary man, and his hands were as big as wheelbarrows. He lived in a vast underground cavern, not far from our filling station, and he only came out into the open when it was dark. Occasionally, as he told his stories, my father would stride up and down, waving his arms and waggling his fingers, but mostly he would sit close to me on the edge of my bunk and speak very softly. The Big Friendly Giant makes his magic powders out of the dreams that children dream when they're asleep. How? Tell me, Dad. Dreams, my love, are very mysterious things. They float around in the night air like little clouds. Can you see them? Nobody can see them. Then how does the Big Friendly Giant catch them? Ah, that is the interesting part. A dream, you see, as it goes drifting through the night air, makes a tiny little buzzing, humming sound. A sound so soft and low it's impossible for ordinary people to hear it. But the BFG can hear it easily. He can hear the whisperings of ants. He can hear the sudden shrill cry of pain a tree gives out when a woodsman cuts into it with an axe. Ah, yes, my darling. There's a whole world of sound around us that we cannot hear. What happens when he catches the dreams? He imprisons them in glass bottles and screws the tops down tight. He has thousands of these bottles in his cave. Does he catch bad dreams as well as good ones? Yes, but he only uses good ones in his powders. What does he do with the bad ones? He explodes them. What does the BFG do with his powders after he's made them? In the dead of night, he goes prowling through the villages, searching for houses where children are asleep. Because of his great height, he can reach windows that are 1 and even 2 flights up. And when he finds a room with a sleeping child, he opens his suitcase. His suitcase? The FG always carries a suitcase and a blowpipe. The blowpipe is as long as a lamppost. The suitcase is for the powders. So he opens the suitcase and selects exactly the right powder, and he puts it into the blowpipe, and he slides the blowpipe in through the open window, and poof, he blows in the powder. And the powder floats around the room, and the child breathes it in. And then what? And then, Danny, the child begins to dream a marvellous and fantastic dream. And suddenly, the dream is not a dream any longer, but a real happening. And the child is fully awake and is actually in the place of the dream and is taking part in the whole thing, in real life. More about that tomorrow. It's getting late. Good night, Danny. Go to sleep. My father kissed me, and then he turned down the wick of the little paraffin lamp until the flame went out. He seated himself in front of the wood stove, which now made a lovely red glow in the dark room. Dad. What is it? Have you ever actually seen the big friendly giant? Once, my father said. Only once. You did? Where? I was out behind the caravan, and it was a clear moonlit night, and I happened to look up, and suddenly I saw this tremendous tall person running along the crest of the hill. Were you frightened, Dad? No. It was thrilling to see him, and a little eerie, but I wasn't frightened. Go to sleep now. My father was a fine mechanic. People who lived miles away used to bring their cars to him for repair rather than take them to the nearest garage. He loved engines. A petrol engine is sheer magic, he said to me once. Just imagine being able to take 1,000 different bits of metal, and if you fit them all together in a certain way, and then if you feed them a little oil and petrol, and if you press a little switch, suddenly those bits of metal will all come to life, and they'll purr and hum and roar. It was inevitable that I too should fall in love with engines and cars. Don't forget that even before I could walk, the workshop had been my playroom. My toys were the greasy cogs and springs and pistons that lay around all over the place, and these, I can promise you, were far more fun to play with than most of the plastic stuff children are given these days. So, almost from birth, I began training to be a mechanic. But now that I was 5 years old, there was the problem of school to think about. We were in the workshop, I remember, on my 5th birthday, when the talk about school started. I was helping my father to fit new brake linings to the rear wheel of a big Ford, when suddenly he said to me, "You know something interesting, Danny? You must be easily the best 5-year-old mechanic in the world." This was the greatest compliment he had ever paid me. I was enormously pleased. "You like this work, don't you? All this messing about with engines?" "I absolutely love it," I said. He turned and faced me and laid a hand gently on my shoulder. "I want to teach you to be a great mechanic. And when you grow up, I hope you will become a famous designing engineer. A man who designs new and better engines for cars and airplanes. For that, you will need a really good education. But I don't want to send you to school quite yet. In another 2 years, you'll have learned enough here with me to be able to take a small engine completely to pieces and put it together again all by yourself. After that, you can go to school." You probably think my father was crazy trying to teach a young child to be an expert mechanic, but as a matter of fact, he wasn't crazy at all. I learned fast, and I adored every moment of it. And luckily for us, nobody came knocking on the door to ask why I wasn't attending school. So 2 more years went by, and at the age of 7, believe it or not, I really could take a small engine to pieces and put it together again. The time had come to start school. My school was in the nearest village, 2 miles away. We didn't have a car of our own, we couldn't afford one. But the walk took only half an hour, and I didn't mind that in the least. My father came with me. He insisted on coming. and when school ended at 4 in the afternoon, he was always there, waiting to walk me home. And so life went on. The world I lived in consisted only of the filling station, the workshop, the caravan, the school, and, of course, the woods and fields and streams in the countryside around. But I was never bored. It was impossible to be bored in my father's company. He was too sparky a man for that. Plots and plans and new ideas came flying off him like sparks from a grindstone. "There's a good wind today," he said one Saturday morning. "Just right for flying a kite. Let's make a kite, Danny." So we made a kite, and together we walked to the top of the hill behind the filling station to release the kite. It caught the wind and soared upward like a huge blue bird. "Let out some more, Danny," he cried. "Go on, as much as you like." Higher and higher soared the kite. "Let's walk it back to the caravan," my father said. So we walked down the hill again with me holding the string and the kite still pulling fiercely on the other end. When we came to the caravan, we were careful not to get the string tangled in the apple tree, and we brought it all the way round to the front steps. "Tie it to the steps," my father said. "Will it still stay up?" "Oh, well, if the wind doesn't drop." The wind didn't drop, and I will tell you something amazing. That kite stayed up there all through the night. Not long after that, on a lovely still evening when there was no breath of wind anywhere, my father said to me, "This is just the right weather for a fire balloon. Let's make a fire balloon." He must have planned this one beforehand, because he had already bought the 4 big sheets of tissue paper and the pot of glue from Mr. Whitton's bookshop in the village. And now, using only the paper, the glue, a pair of scissors, and a piece of thin wire, he made me a huge, magnificent fire balloon in less than 15 minutes. In the opening at the bottom, he tied a ball of cotton wool, and we were ready to go. It was getting dark when we carried it outside into the field behind the caravan. I held the balloon upright while my father crouched underneath it and carefully poured a little meths onto the ball of cotton wool. "Here goes," he said, putting a match to the cotton wool. "Hold the sides out as much as you can, Danny." A tall yellow flame leapt up from the ball of cotton wool and went right inside the balloon. "It'll catch on fire," I cried. "No, it won't. Watch." Between us, we held the sides of the balloon out as much as possible to keep them away from the flame in the early stages. But soon the hot air filled the balloon, and the danger was over. "She's nearly ready," my father said. "Can you feel her floating?" "Yes. Shall we let go?" "No, not yet. Wait a bit longer. Wait until she's tugging to fly away." "She's tugging now." "Right. Let her go." Slowly, majestically, and in absolute silence, our wonderful balloon began to rise up into the night sky. "It flies!" I shouted, clapping my hands and jumping about. Up and up it went, rising very fast now in the cool night air. It was like a magic fireball in the sky. "Let's follow it," my father said, "and with luck we'll find it when it comes down." We ran to the road. We ran along the road. We kept running. "She's coming down," my father shouted. "The flame's nearly gone out." We lost sight of it when the flame went out, but we guessed roughly which field it would be landing in, and we climbed over a gate and ran towards the place. For half an hour we searched the field in the darkness, but we couldn't find our balloon. The next morning I went back alone to search again. I searched 4 big fields before I found it. It was lying in the corner of a field that was full of black and white cows. The cows were all standing round it and staring at it with their huge wet eyes. But they hadn't harmed it one bit. So I carried it home and hung it up alongside the kite. "You can fly the kite all by yourself any time you like," my father said, "but you must never fly the fire balloon unless I'm with you. It's extremely dangerous." "All right," I said. Then there was the tree house, which we built high up in the top of the big oak at the bottom of our field, and a bow and arrow, and stilts that made me 10 feet tall, and a boomerang that came back. And for my last birthday, there had been something that was more fun perhaps than all the rest. For 2 days before my birthday, I'd been forbidden to enter the workshop because my father was in there working on a secret. And on the birthday morning, out came an amazing machine made from 4 bicycle wheels and several large soap boxes. But this was no ordinary whizzer. It had a brake pedal, a steering wheel, a comfortable seat, and a strong front bumper to take the shock of a crash. I called it Sopo, and just about every day I would take it up to the top of the hill in the field behind the filling station and come shooting down again at incredible speeds. So, you can see that being 8 years old and living with my father was a lot of fun. But I was impatient to be 9. I reckoned that being 9 would be even more fun than being 8. As it turned out, I was not altogether right about this. My 9th year was certainly more exciting than any of the others, but not all of it was exactly what you would call fun. You will learn as you get older, just as I learned that autumn, that no father is perfect. Grown-ups are complicated creatures, full of quirks and secrets. Some have quirkier quirks and deeper secrets than others, but all of them, including one's own parents, have 2 or 3 private habits hidden up their sleeves that would probably make you gasp if you knew about them. The rest of this story is about a most private and secret habit my father had, and about the strange adventures that it led us both into. It all started on a Saturday evening. It was the first Saturday of September. Around 6 o'clock, my father and I had supper together in the caravan as usual. Then I went to bed. For some reason, I woke up during the night. I lay still, listening for the sound of my father's breathing in the bunk above mine. I could hear nothing. He wasn't there. This meant that he'd gone back to the workshop to finish a job. I listened for the usual workshop sounds, the little clinking noises of metal against metal or the tap of a hammer. But on this night, no sound came from the workshop. The filling station was silent. I got out of my bunk and found a box of matches by the sink. I struck one and held it up to the funny old clock that hung on the wall above the kettle. It said 11:10. I went to the door of the caravan. "Dad," I said softly. "Dad, are you there?" No answer. In pyjamas and bare feet, I went down the caravan steps and crossed over to the workshop. I switched on the light. The old car we'd been working on through the day was still there, but not my father. I've already told you he did not have a car of his own, so there was no question of his having gone for a drive. So I thought he must have fainted suddenly from some awful illness or fallen down and banged his head. I would need a light if I was going to find him. I took the torch from the bench in the workshop. I looked in the office. I went around and searched behind the office and behind the workshop. I ran down the field to the lavatory. It was empty. I ran back to the caravan. He definitely wasn't in his bunk. I stood in the dark caravan, and for the first time in my life, I felt a touch of panic. The filling station was a long way from the nearest farmhouse. I took the blanket from my bunk and put it round my shoulders. Then I went out the caravan door and sat on the platform with my feet on the top step of the ladder. The silence was deathly. I don't know how long I sat there. It may have been 1 hour, it could have been 2. But I never dozed off. And at last, from far away, I heard the faint tap-tap of footsteps on the road. The footsteps were coming closer. Tap, 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 tap. Was it him? Or was it somebody else? Tap, 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 tap. Then, out of the mist, a figure appeared. It was him. I jumped down the steps and ran onto the road to meet him. "Danny, what on earth's the matter? I thought something awful had happened to you." He took my hand in his and walked me back to the caravan in silence. Then he tucked me into my bunk. "I'm so sorry," he said. "I should never have done it. But you don't usually wake up, do you?" "Where did you go, Dad?" "You must be tired out." "I'm not a bit tired. Could we light the lamp for a little while?" My father put a match to the wick of the lamp hanging from the ceiling, and the little yellow flame sprang up and filled the inside of the caravan with pale light. "How about a hot drink?" he said. "Yes, please." He lit the paraffin burner and put the kettle on to boil. I have decided something, he said. I am going to let you in on the deepest, darkest secret of my whole life. I was sitting up in the bunk, watching my father. You asked me where I'd been. The truth is, I was up in Hazel's Wood. Hazel's Wood? I cried. That's miles away. 6.5 miles. I know I shouldn't have gone, and I'm very, very sorry about it. His voice trailed away into nothingness. But why would you want to go all the way up to Hazel's Wood? He spooned cocoa powder and sugar into 2 mugs. Do you know what is meant by poaching? Poaching? Not really, no. It means going up into the woods in the dead of night and coming back with something for the pot. Poachers in other places poach all sorts of different things, but around here it's always pheasants. You mean stealing them? I said, aghast. We don't look at it that way. A great poacher is a great artist. Is that actually what you were doing in Hazel's Wood, Dad? Poaching pheasants? I was practicing the art of poaching. I was shocked. My own father a thief. The kettle's boiling, I said. Ah, so it is. He poured the water into the mugs and brought mine over to me. Then he fetched his own and sat with it at the end of my bunk. Your granddad, my own dad, was a magnificent and splendiferous poacher. I caught the poaching fever from him when I was 10 years old, and I never lost it since. Mind you, in those days just about every man in our village was out in the woods at night poaching pheasants. And they did it not only because they loved the sport, but because they needed food for their families. When I was a boy, times were bad for a lot of people in England. There was very little work to be had anywhere, and some families were literally starving. Yet a few miles away, in the rich man's wood, thousands of pheasants were being fed like kings twice a day. So can you blame my dad for going out occasionally and coming home with a bird or two for the family to eat? No, I said, of course not. But we're not starving here, Dad. You've missed the point, Danny boy. Poaching is such a fabulous and exciting sport that once you start doing it, it gets into your blood and you can't give it up. Just imagine, he said, leaping off the bunk and waving his mug in the air. Just imagine for a minute that you are all alone up there in the dark wood, and the wood is full of keepers hiding behind trees, and the keepers have guns. Guns? They don't have guns. All keepers have guns, Danny. It's for the vermin, mostly. The foxes and stoats and weasels who go after the pheasants. But they'll always take a pot at a poacher, too, if they spot him. Dad, you're joking. Not at all. But they only do it from behind. They like to pepper you in the legs at about 50 yards. They can't do that. They could go to prison for shooting someone. You could go to prison for poaching, my father said. There was a glint and a sparkle in his eyes now that I'd never seen before. Many's the night, when I was a boy, Danny, I've gone into the kitchen and seen my old dad lying face down on the table and Mum standing over him, digging the gunshot pellets out of his backside. It's not true, I said, starting to laugh. You don't believe me? Yes, I believe you. Towards the end, he was so covered in tiny little white scars that he looked exactly like it was snowing. I don't know why I'm laughing, I said. It's not funny, it's horrible. Poacher's bottom, they used to call it, my father said. And there wasn't a man in the whole village who didn't have a bit of it, one way or another. How's the cocoa? Fine, thank you. If you're hungry, we could have a midnight feast. Could we, Dad? Of course. My father got out the bread tin and the butter and the cheese and started making sandwiches. Let me tell you about this phony pheasant shooting business, he said. First of all, it is practiced only by the rich. Wealthy idiots spend huge sums of money every year buying baby pheasants from pheasant farms and rearing them in pens until they're big enough to be put out into the woods. Then they're guarded by keepers and fed twice a day on the best corn until they're so fat they can hardly fly. Then beaters are hired, who walk through the woods making as much noise as they can to drive the half-tame pheasants towards half-baked men and their guns. After that, it's bang, 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 and down they come. Would you like strawberry jam on one of these? Yes, please, I said. One jam and one cheese. But, Dad, what? How do you actually catch the pheasants when you're poaching? Do you have a gun hidden away up there? A gun? He cried, disgusted. Real poachers don't shoot pheasants, Danny. Didn't you know that? You've only got to fire a cap pistol up in those woods and the keepers will be on you. Then how do you do it? Ah, these things are very big secrets. But I reckon if my father could tell them to me, then maybe I can tell them to you. Would you like me to do that? Yes. Tell me now. All the best ways of poaching pheasants were discovered by my old dad. My father put my sandwiches on a plate and brought them over to my bunk. Do you know, my old dad actually used to keep a flock of prime roosters in the backyard just to practice on. A rooster is very much like a pheasant, you see. They're equally stupid. So, whenever my dad thought up a new method of catching pheasants, he tried it out on a rooster first. What are the best ways? Promise you won't tell another soul. I promise. It's more than a secret, Danny. It's the most important discovery in the whole history of poaching. He edged a shade closer to me. Suddenly his voice became soft and very private. Pheasants, he whispered, are crazy about raisins. Is that the big secret? That's it. It may not sound very much when I say it like that, but believe me, it is. Raisins. Just ordinary raisins. You throw a few raisins into a bunch of pheasants, and they'll start fighting each other to get at them. Method number 1 is known as the horsehair stopper. The horsehair stopper. That's it, my father said. And the reason it's such a brilliant method is that it's completely silent. First, you take a few raisins and soak them in water overnight to make them plump and soft and juicy. Then you get a bit of good stiff horsehair and cut it up into half-inch lengths. Then you push one of these lengths through the middle of a raisin, so there's just a tiny bit of horsehair sticking out on each side. You are now ready to catch a pheasant. If you want to catch more than one, you prepare more raisins. Then, when evening comes, you creep up into the woods, making sure you get there before the pheasants have gone up into the trees to roost. Then you scatter the raisins, and soon along comes a pheasant and gobbles it up. What happens then? Here's what my dad discovered. First of all, the horsehair makes the raisin stick in the pheasant's throat. It doesn't hurt him. It simply stays there and tickles. It's rather like having a crumb stuck in your own throat. But after that, believe it or not, the pheasant never moves his feet again. He becomes absolutely rooted to the spot, and there he stands, pumping his silly neck up and down just like a piston, and all you've got to do is to nip out quickly from the place where you're hiding and pick him up. Is that really true, Dad? I swear it. Once a pheasant's at the horsehair stopper, you can turn a hose pipe on him and he won't move. My father paused. So, that's method number 1. What's number 2? Number 2's a real beauty. I can even remember the day it was invented. I was just about the same age as you are now, and it was a Sunday morning, and my dad comes into the kitchen holding a huge white rooster in his hands and puts the bird down right in the middle of the kitchen table. By golly, he says, I got a good one this time. A good what? Mum says, looking up from the sink. Horace, take that filthy bird off my table. The rooster has a funny little paper hat over its head, like an ice cream cone upside down. And my dad is pointing to it proudly and saying, Stroke him. Go on, stroke him. Do anything you like to him. He won't move an inch. The rooster starts scratching away at the paper hat with one of its feet, but the hat seems to be stuck on and it won't come off. No bird in the world is going to run away once you cover up its eyes, my dad says. And he starts poking the rooster with his finger and pushing it around on the table. The rooster doesn't take the slightest bit of notice. You can have this one, he says to Mum. You can have it and wring its neck and dish it up for dinner as a celebration of what I just invented." And then straightway he takes me by the arm and marches me quickly out of the door, and we go over the fields, and in less than 2 hours we get 5 lovely fat pheasants, with no more trouble than it takes to go out and buy them in the shop. My father paused for breath. "But, Dad, how do you get the paper hats over the pheasants' heads?" "You'd never guess it, Danny. Tell me." "Listen carefully. First of all, you dig a little hole in the ground. Then you twist a piece of paper into the shape of a cone, and you fit this into the hole, hollow end up, like a cup. Then you smear the inside of the paper cup with glue and drop in a few raisins. At the same time, you lay a trail of raisins along the ground leading up to it. Now, the old pheasant comes pecking along the trail, and when he gets to the hole, he pops his head inside to gobble up the raisins, and the next thing he knows, he's got a paper hat stuck over his eyes and he can't see a thing. Isn't that a fantastic idea, Danny? My dad called it a sticky hat." "Is that the one you used this evening?" My father nodded. "How many did you get, Dad?" "Well," he said, looking a bit sheepish, "actually I didn't get any. I arrived too late. By the time I got there, they were already going up to roost. That shows you how out of practice I am." "Was it fun all the same?" "Marvellous. Just like the old days." He undressed and put on his pyjamas. Then he turned out the lamp in the ceiling and climbed up into his bunk. "Dad," I whispered. "What is it?" "Have you been doing this often after I'd gone to sleep, without me knowing it?" "No. Tonight was the first time for 9 years. When your mother died, I made a vow to give up poaching until you were old enough to be left alone at nights. But this evening I broke my vow. I'm very sorry I did it." "If you ever want to go again, I won't mind." "Do you mean that? Do you really mean it?" "Yes, so long as you tell me beforehand." "Good boy. And we'll have roast pheasant for supper whenever we want it." "And one day, Dad, will you take me with you?" "Ah, I reckon you're just a bit young to be dodging around up there in the dark. I wouldn't want you to get peppered with buckshot in the backside at your age." "Your dad took you at my age?" There was a short silence. "We'll see how it goes," my father said. "Good night, Danny. Go to sleep now." "Good night, Dad." The following Friday, while we were having supper in the caravan, my father said, "If it's all right with you, Danny, I'll be going out again tomorrow night." "Will it be Hazel's Wood again?" "It'll always be Hazel's Wood. First, because that's where all the pheasants are, and second, because I don't like Mr. Hazel one little bit, and it's a pleasure to poach his birds." I must pause here to tell you something about Mr. Victor Hazel. He was a brewer of beer, and he owned a huge brewery. He was rich beyond words, and his property stretched for miles along either side of the valley. All the land around us belonged to him, everything on both sides of the road. Everything except the small patch of ground on which our filling station stood. That patch belonged to my father. Mr. Victor Hazel was a roaring snob, and he tried desperately to get in with what he believed were the right kind of people. He hunted with the hounds and gave shooting parties and wore fancy waistcoats. Every weekday he drove his enormous silver Rolls-Royce past our filling station on his way to the brewery. As he flashed by, we would sometimes catch a glimpse of the great glistening, beery face above the wheel, pink as a ham, all soft and inflamed from drinking too much beer. "No," my father said, "I do not like Mr. Victor Hazel one little bit. I haven't forgotten the way he spoke to you last year when he came in for a fill-up." I hadn't forgotten it either. Mr. Hazel had pulled up alongside the pumps. "Fill her up and look sharp about it." I was 8 years old at the time. He didn't get out of the car. He just handed me the key to the cap of the petrol tank, and as he did so, he barked out, "And keep your filthy little hands to yourself, do you understand?" I didn't understand at all, so I said, "What do you mean, sir?" There was a leather riding crop on the seat beside him. He picked it up and pointed it at me like a pistol. If you make any dirty finger marks on my paintwork, I'll step right out of this car and give you a good hiding. My father was out at the workshop almost before Mr. Hazel had finished speaking. He strode up to the window of the car and placed his hands on the sill and leaned in. "I don't like you speaking to my son like that," he said. Mr. Hazel did not look at him. He sat quite still in the seat of his Rolls-Royce. "Next time you threaten someone with a good hiding, I suggest you pick on a person your own size," my father said. "Like me, for instance." Mr. Hazel did not move. "Now go away, please. We do not wish to serve you." He took the key from my hand and tossed it through the window. The Rolls-Royce drove away fast in a cloud of dust. The very next day, an inspector from the local Department of Health arrived and said he'd come to inspect our caravan. "What do you want to inspect our caravan for?" my father asked. "To see if it's a fit place for humans to live in. We don't allow people to live in dirty, broken-down shacks these days." My father showed him the inside of the caravan, which was spotlessly clean as always and as cosy as could be, and in the end the man had to admit there was nothing wrong with it. Soon after that, another inspector turned up and took a sample of petrol from one of our underground storage tanks. My father explained to me they were checking to see if we were mixing some of our second-grade petrol in with the first-grade stuff, which is an old dodge practiced by crooked filling station owners. Of course, we were not doing this. Hardly a week went by without some local official dropping in to check up on one thing or another, and there was little doubt, my father said, that the long and powerful arm of Mr. Hazel was reaching out and trying to run us off our land. So, all in all, you can see why it gave my father a certain pleasure to poach Mr. Victor Hazel's pheasants. That night, we put the raisins in to soak. The next day was poaching day, and don't think my father didn't know it. From the moment he got out of his bunk in the morning, the excitement began to build up inside him. This was a Saturday, so I was home from school, and we spent most of the day in the workshop, decarbonising the cylinders of Mr. Pratchett's Austin 7. "I want to be away at 6 o'clock, my father said. "Then I'll get to the wood exactly at twilight." "Why at twilight?" I asked. "Because at twilight, everything inside the wood becomes veiled and shady. You can see to move around, but it's not easy for someone else to see you." "Why don't you wait till it gets really dark?" "You wouldn't catch anything if you did that. When night comes on, all the pheasants fly up into the trees to roost." "When will you be back?" "About 10 o'clock. 10:30 at the latest." "You're quite sure you don't mind being left alone?" "Quite sure. But you will be all right, won't you, Dad?" "Don't you worry about me," he said, putting his arm round my shoulders and giving me a hug. "But you said there wasn't a man in your dad's village that didn't get a bit shot up by the keepers sooner or later." "Ah, yes, I did say that, didn't I? But in those days there were lots more keepers up in the woods than there are now." "How many are there now in Hazel's Wood?" "Not too many." As the day wore on, I could see my father getting more and more impatient and excited. By 5 o'clock we'd finished work on the baby Austin, and together we ran her up and down the road to test her out. At 5:30 we had an early supper of sausages and bacon, but my father hardly ate anything at all. At 6 o'clock precisely, he kissed me goodbye and said, "Promise not to wait up for me, Danny. Put yourself to bed at 8 and go to sleep, right?" He set off down the road, and I stood on the platform of the caravan watching him go. He turned and waved to me. I waved back. Then he disappeared round a bend in the road. Inside the caravan, I stood on a chair and lit the oil lamp in the ceiling. I had some weekend homework to do, so I laid my books out on the table and sat down. But I found it impossible to keep my mind on my work. The clock said 7:30. This was the twilight time. He would be there now. I pictured him. Inside the wood I could see him treading carefully over the leafy ground, all the time searching and searching for the keeper, who would somewhere be standing still as a post with a gun under his arm. I closed my books. It was no good trying to work. I decided to go to bed instead. I undressed and put on my pajamas and climbed into my bunk. Soon I fell asleep. When I opened my eyes again, the oil lamp was still glowing, and the clock on the wall said 10 minutes past 2. 10 minutes past 2. I jumped out of my bunk and looked into the bunk above mine. It was empty. He had promised he would be home by 10:30 at the latest, and he never broke promises. He was nearly 4 hours overdue. At that moment, a frightful sense of doom came over me. Hold it, don't get panicky. Last week you got all panicky and you made a bit of a fool of yourself. Yes, but last week was a different thing altogether. I promise I'll be back by 10:30. Those were his exact words. And he never, absolutely never, broke a promise. It took me 2 seconds to decide what I should do. Very quickly, I stripped off my pajamas and put on my shirt and my jeans. Perhaps the keepers had shot him up so badly he couldn't walk. I pulled my sweater over my head. Perhaps he was lying in the wood bleeding to death. How long would it take me to get to the wood? An hour and a half. Less if I ran most of the way, but not much less. I ran down the steps of the caravan and across to the workshop to get the torch. A torch is a good companion when you're alone outdoors at night, and I wanted it with me. I grabbed the torch and went out to the workshop. I paused for a moment beside the pumps. There was no wind at all, no sound of any kind. To my right, going away into the blackness of the countryside, lay the lonely road that led to the dangerous wood. 6.5 miles. At that point, a wild and marvellous idea came to me. Why shouldn't I go in the baby Austin? I really did know how to drive. My father had always allowed me to move the cars around. This was an emergency. If Dad was wounded and bleeding badly, then every minute counted. I'd never driven on the road, but I would go very slowly and keep in close to the hedge on the proper side. I went back to the workshop and switched on the light. I opened the double doors. I got into the driver's seat of the baby Austin. I turned on the ignition key. I pulled out the choke. I found the starter button and pressed it. The motor coughed once, then started. Now for the lights. There was a pointed switch on the dashboard, and I turned it to S for side lights only. Then I slipped the gear lever into reverse. Slowly, I backed the car out of the workshop. I left her ticking over and went back to switch off the workshop light. It was better to keep everything looking as normal as possible. The filling station was in darkness now, except for a dim light coming from the caravan where the little oil lamp was still burning. I decided to leave that on. I got back into the car. I switched on the headlamps. That was better. I searched for the dipper with my foot. I found it, I tried it, and it worked. I put the headlamps on full. If I met another car, I must remember to dip them. I pressed down the clutch pedal again and pushed the gear lever into first. This was it. My heart was thumping away so fiercely I could hear it in my throat. 10 yards away lay the main road. It was as dark as doomsday. I released the clutch very slowly. At the same time, I pressed down just a fraction of an inch on the accelerator with my right toe. And stealthily, oh, most wonderfully, the little car began to lean forward and steal into motion. I pressed a shade harder on the accelerator. We crept out of the filling station onto the dark, deserted road. I will not pretend I wasn't petrified. I was. But mixed in with the awful was a glorious feeling of excitement. I sat very stiff and upright in my seat. My eyes were about level with the top of the steering wheel. I could have done with a cushion to raise me up higher, but it was too late for that. The road seemed awfully narrow in the dark. I knew there was room enough for 2 cars to pass each other. I'd seen them from the filling station doing it 1,000,000 times, but it didn't look that way to me from where I was. Was I too much in the middle of the road? Yes, I was, but I didn't want to pull in closer for fear of hitting the bank. The motor was beginning to rattle and shake. I was still in first gear. It was vital to change up into second. Well, here goes. I eased my foot off the accelerator. I pressed the clutch down and held it there. I found the gear lever and pulled it straight back from first into second. I released the clutch and pressed on the accelerator. The little car leapt forward as though it had been stung. We were in second gear. What speed were we going? I glanced at the speedometer. It said 15 miles an hour. Good, that was quite fast enough. I started figuring out how long it would take me to do 6 miles, travelling at 15 miles an hour. At 60 miles an hour, 6 miles would take 6 minutes. At 30, it would take twice as long, 12 minutes. At 15, it would take twice as long again, 24 minutes. I kept going. I knew every bit of the road, every curve and every little rise and dip. I began to worry about the motor. I knew very well it would be certain to overheat if I drove for long in either first or second gear. I must now change up into third. I took a deep breath and grasped the gear lever again. Foot off the accelerator, clutch in, gear lever up and across and up again, clutch out. I'd done it. I pressed down on the accelerator. The speedometer crept up to 30. Hazel's Wood was not on the main road. To reach it, you had to turn left through a gap in the hedge and go uphill over a bumpy track for about a quarter of a mile. I figured I must be getting pretty close to the turning place now. Suddenly, just below the rim of the night sky, I saw a splash of yellow light. This was something I'd been dreading all along. Very quickly the light got brighter and brighter and nearer, and in a few seconds it took shape and became the long white beam of headlamps from a car rushing towards me. My turning place must be very close now. I was desperate to reach it and swing off the road before that monster reached me. I pressed my foot hard down for more speed. The little engine roared. The speedometer needle went from 30 to 35 and then to 40, but the other car was closing fast. Its headlamps were like two dazzling white eyes. They grew bigger and bigger, and suddenly the whole road in front of me was lit up as clear as daylight, and swish! The thing went past me like a bullet. It was so close, I felt the wind of it through my open window. And in that tiny fraction of a second, when the two of us were alongside one another, I caught a glimpse of its white-painted body, and I knew it was the police. I didn't dare look round to see if they were stopping and coming back after me. I was certain they would stop. Any policeman in the world would stop if he suddenly passed a small boy in a tiny car chugging along a lonely road at 2:30 in the morning. I pressed my foot harder still on the accelerator. Then all at once I saw in my own dim headlamps the tiny gap in the hedge on my left-hand side. There wasn't time to brake or slow down, so I just yanked the wheel hard over and prayed. The little car swerved violently off the road, leapt through the gap, hit the rising ground, then skidded round sideways behind the hedge and stopped. The first thing I did was to switch off all my lights, and I sat very still in my dark car. The hedge was a thick one, and I couldn't see through it. The car had bounced and skidded sideways in such a way that it was now right off the track. I could hear the police car. It was backing and turning. The road was far too narrow for it to turn round in one go. Then the roar from the motor got louder, and he came back fast with engine revving and headlamps blazing. He flashed past the place where I was hiding and raced away into the night. That meant the policeman had not seen me swing off the road. But he was certain to come back again looking for me. And if he came back slowly enough, he would probably see the gap. He would stop and get out of his car. He would walk through the gap and look behind the hedge, and then his torch would shine in my face, and he would say, "What's going on, Sonny? What's the big idea? Whose car is this? Where do you live? Where are your parents?" He would make me go with him to the police station, and in the end they would get the whole story out of me, and my father would be ruined. I sat quiet as a mouse and waited. I waited for a long time. Then I heard the sound of the motor coming back again in my direction. It was making a terrific noise. He was going flat out. He whizzed past me like a rocket. The way he was gunning that motor told me he was a very angry man. He must have been a very puzzled man, too. I waited to see if he would come back again. He didn't come. I switched on my lights. I pressed the starter. She started at once. I put her into gear and very gently began to ease her forward. I listened carefully for horrid noises. There were none. I managed to get her off the grass and back onto the track. I drove very slowly now. The track was extremely rough and rutted. Then, at last, ahead of me and over to the right, looking like some gigantic black creature crouching on the crest of the hill, I saw Hazel's Wood. Soon I was there. I stopped the car. I switched off the motor and the lights. I got out, taking the torch with me. I squeezed my way through a hedge, and suddenly I was right inside the wood. "Dad!" I called out. "Dad!" Are you there? My small, high voice echoed through the forest and faded away. I listened for an answer, but none came. End of Side 1. Side 2. I cannot possibly describe to you what it felt like to be standing alone in the pitchy blackness. The sense of loneliness was overwhelming. I tried to keep absolutely still for as long as possible to see if I could hear anything at all. I had a queer feeling that the whole wood was listening with me. The trees and the bushes, the little animals hiding in the undergrowth, and the birds roosting in the branches. All were listening. I switched on the torch. A brilliant beam of light reached out ahead of me like a long white arm. Now, at any rate, I could see where I was going. The keepers would also see, but I didn't care about the keepers anymore. The only person I cared about was my father. I wanted him back. I kept the torch on and went deeper into the wood. Dad! Dad! It's Danny! Are you there? I didn't know which direction I was going in. I just went on walking and calling out, walking and calling. And each time I called, I would stop and listen. But no answer came. After a time, my voice began to go all trembly. I started to say silly things like, "Oh, Dad, please tell me where you are. Please answer me. Are you there, Dad? It's Danny." I stood still, listening, listening, listening. And in the silence that followed, I heard, or thought I heard, the faint, but oh so faint, sound of a human voice. I froze and kept listening. Yes, there it was again. I ran towards the sound. "Dad!" I shouted. "It's Danny! Where are you?" I stopped again. This time, the answer came just loud enough for me to hear the words. "I'm here," the voice called out. "Over here!" It was him. "Where are you, Danny?" my father called out. "I'm here, Dad, I'm coming." With the beam of the torch shining ahead of me, I ran towards the voice. And all at once his voice was right in front of me. "Stop, Danny, stop!" he shouted. I stopped dead. I shone the torch over the ground. I couldn't see him. "Where are you, Dad?" "I'm down here. Come forward slowly, but be careful. Don't fall in." I crept forward. Then I saw the pit. I went to the edge of it and shone the light downward, and there was my father. He was sitting on the floor of the pit, and he looked up into the light and said, "Hello, my marvellous darling. Thank you for coming." "Are you all right, Dad?" "My ankle seems to be broken. It happened when I fell in." The pit had been dug in the shape of a square, with each side about 6 feet long. But it was the depth of it that was so awful. It was at least 12 feet deep. "Does it hurt?" "Yes, it hurts a lot. But I've got to get out of here before morning. The keepers know I'm here, and they're coming back for me as soon as it gets light." "Did they dig the hole to catch people?" "Yes." I shone my light around the top of the pit, and saw how the keepers had covered it over with sticks and leaves, and how the whole thing had collapsed when my father stepped on it. It was the kind of trap hunters in Africa dig to catch wild animals. "Do the keepers know who you are?" "No. 2 of them came and shone a light down on me, but I covered my face with my arms, and they couldn't recognize me. I heard them trying to guess. They were guessing all sorts of names, but they didn't mention mine. Then one of them shouted, 'We'll find out who you are all right in the morning, my lad. And guess who's coming with us to fish you out? Mr. Victor Hazel himself.'" Ouch! My poor ankle. "Have the keepers gone, Dad?" "Yes, they've gone for the night." I was kneeling on the edge of the pit. I wanted so badly to go down and comfort him, but that would have been madness. "What time is it? Shine the light down so I can see." I did as he asked. "It's 10 to 3. We must be out of here before sunrise." "Dad?" "Yes?" "I came in the baby Austin." "You what?" I wanted to get here quickly, so I just drove it out of the workshop and came straight here. You're crazy. It wasn't difficult. You could have been killed. I went fine, Dad. Where is it now? Just outside the wood on the bumpy track. His face was all puckered up with pain and as white as a sheet of paper. Are you all right? Yes, I'm fine. He was shivering all over, though it was a warm night. If only we could get you out. I'll never get out of here without a ladder. Wouldn't a rope do? A rope? Yes, of course. There's one in the baby Austin. It's under the back seat. Mr. Pratchett always carries a tow rope in case of a breakdown. I'll get it, I said. Wait there, Dad. I left him and ran back the way I'd come. I got the tow rope and slung it over my shoulder. I wriggled through the hedge and ran back into the wood. Where are you, Dad? Over here. I got the rope. Good. Now tie one end of it to the nearest tree. Using the torch all the time, I tied one end of the rope round the nearest tree. I lowered the other end down to my father. He grasped it with both hands and hauled himself up into a standing position. He stood only on his right leg. He kept his left foot off the ground by bending his knee. Jeepers, he said. This hurts. Do you think you can make it, Dad? We've got to make it. Is the rope tied properly? Yes. I saw his knuckles tighten as he gripped the rope. Then he came up, hand over hand, and as soon as he was in reach, I got hold of one of his arms and pulled for all I was worth. He came over the top edge of the pit, sliding on his chest and stomach. He lay on the ground, breathing fast and loud. Let me rest a moment. I waited, kneeling beside him. All right, he said. Now for the next bit. Give me a hand, Danny. You'll have to do most of the work from now on. I helped him to keep his balance as he got up onto his one good foot. I moved up close to his right side, and he put both hands on my shoulders. You can lean harder than that, I said. Shine the light forward so we can see where we're going. Let's go, he said. Hop, hop, hop. Does it hurt terribly, Dad? It does when I hop, he said. Each time I hop, it jars it. There's the hedge, I said, waving the torch. We're nearly there. Hop, hop, hop. When we reached the hedge, my legs gave way and we both crashed to the ground. I'm sorry, I said. It's okay. Can you help me get through the hedge? He crawled a bit and I pulled a bit, and little by little we squeezed through. We sat on the grassy bank under the hedge to get a breather. Shall I drive? I said. You'll have to. I've only got one foot. I helped him to hop over to the car, and after a bit of a struggle, he managed to get in. The rope, I said. We left it behind. Forget it, he said. It doesn't matter. I started the motor and switched on the headlamps. I backed the car and turned it round, and soon we were heading downhill on the bumpy track. We reached the bottom of the track and turned onto the road. With my father's hand on the wheel, I had no fear of hitting the hedge or anything else, so I pressed down hard on the accelerator, and soon we were home. As we approached the filling station, my father said, I'll have to go to hospital for this. It must be set properly, and then put into plaster. How long will you be in hospital? Don't worry, I'll be home before evening. Will you be able to walk? Yes, they fix a metal thing into the plaster. It sticks out underneath the foot. Should we go to the hospital now? No, he said. I'll just lie down on the floor of the workshop and wait till it's time to call Doc Spencer. He'll arrange everything. Call him now, I said. No, I don't like waking doctors up at 4:30 in the morning. What will you tell him, Dad? I mean, about how it happened. I'll tell him the truth. Doc Spencer's my friend. We pulled into the filling station, and I parked the car right up against the workshop doors. I helped my father to get out. Then I held him round the waist as he hop-hopped the short distance into the workshop. Inside the workshop, he leaned against the tool bench for support and told me what to do next. First, I spread some sheets of newspaper out over the oily floor. Then I ran to the caravan and fetched 2 blankets and a pillow. I laid 1 blanket on the floor over the newspaper. I helped my father to lie down on the blanket. Then I put the pillow under his head and covered him up with the 2nd blanket. "Put the phone down here so I can reach it." I did as he asked. "Can I get you anything, Dad? What about a hot drink?" "No, thank you. I mustn't have a thing. I'm going to have an anesthetic soon, and you mustn't eat or drink anything at all before that. But you have something. Go and make yourself some breakfast. Then go to bed." "I'd like to wait here till the doctor comes." "Well, you must be dead tired, Danny." "I'm all right." I found an old wooden chair and pulled it up near him and sat down. He closed his eyes and seemed to be dozing off. My own eyes kept closing too. I couldn't keep them open. The next thing I heard was Doc Spencer's voice saying to my father, "Well, my goodness me, William, what on earth have you been up to?" I opened my eyes and saw the doctor bending down over my father, who was still lying on the floor of the workshop. My father once told me that Doc Spencer had been looking after the people of our district for nearly 45 years. He was over 70 now and could have retired long ago, but he didn't want to retire, and his patients didn't want him to either. He was a tiny man with tiny hands and feet and a tiny round face. The face was as brown and wrinkled as a shriveled apple. "Which ankle?" he asked. "The left one," my father said. Doc Spencer knelt on the floor and took from his bag a pair of large scissors. Then, to my astonishment, he proceeded to slit the cloth of my father's left trouser leg right up to the knee. He parted the cloth and looked at the ankle, but he didn't touch it. I looked at it too. The foot seemed to be bent round sideways, and there was a huge swelling below the ankle bone. "That's a nasty one," Doc Spencer said. "We'd better get you into hospital right away. May I use your phone?" He called the hospital and asked for an ambulance. Then he spoke to someone else about taking X-rays and doing an operation. "How's the pain?" Doc Spencer asked. "Would you like me to give you something?" "No, I'll wait till I get there." "As you wish, William." "But how on earth did you do it?" The doctor waited. "I was mooching around up in Hazel's Wood." "Ah. And what's it like up there these days? Plenty of pheasants?" "Stacks of 'em." "It's a great game," Doc Spencer said, sighing a little. "I only wish I was young enough to have another go at it." He looked up and saw me staring at him. "You didn't know I used to do a bit of poaching myself, did you, Danny?" "No," I said, absolutely flabbergasted. "Many a night after evening surgery was over, I used to slip out the back door and go striding over the fields to one of my secret places. Sometimes it was pheasants, and other times it was trout. Plenty of big brown trout in the stream in those days." My father closed his tired eyes, then opened them again. "Which method did you use for pheasants?" "Gin and raisins," Doc Spencer said. "I used to soak the raisins in gin for a week, then scatter them in the woods." "It doesn't work." "I know it doesn't," the doctor said, "but it was enormous fun. I never caught any. But I was hot stuff with trout. Do you know how to catch a trout, Danny, without using a rod and line?" "No," I said. "How?" "You tickle him." "Tickle him?" "Yes," the doctor said. "Trout, you see, like to lie close into the river bank, so you go creeping along the bank until you see a big one, and you come up behind him, and you lie down on your tummy, and then slowly, very slowly, you lower your hand into the water behind him, and you slide in underneath him, and you begin to stroke his belly up and down with the tip of one finger. He loves it so much he sort of dozes off, and you quickly grab hold of him and flip him out of the water." "Ah, only a great artist can do that," said my father. "Thank you, William." Dr. Spencer got up off his knees and crossed over to the door of the workshop. "By the way, what happened up there in the woods? Did you step in a rabbit hole?" "It was a slightly bigger hole than that," my father said. "What do you mean?" My father began to describe how he'd fallen into the enormous pit. Doc Spencer stared down at my father. "I don't believe it." "That's perfectly true." "But, great heavens alive, Victor Hazel can't go digging tiger traps in his woods for human beings. It's diabolical." "I never did like that Victor Hazel. Ah, here's the ambulance." The ambulance drew up near the workshop door, and 2 men in uniform got out. "Bring me a leg splint," the doctor said. One of the men fetched a sort of thin wooden plank from the ambulance, and Doc Spencer strapped the leg firmly to the plank, and my father got onto the stretcher. I was still sitting on my chair. Doc Spencer came over to me and put a hand on my shoulder. "I think you'd better come on home with me, young man." "Won't Dad be home today?" "Yes," my father said. "I'll be back this evening. Thank you for offering to take Danny, but it won't be necessary. He'll be all right here till I get back. I reckon he'll sleep most of the day anyhow, won't you, my love?" "I think so," I said. "Just close up the filling station and go to bed, right?" "Right." I stood outside the workshop with Doc Spencer and watched the big white thing drive out of the filling station. As soon as the doctor had driven away, I went into the office and got out the sign that said "Sorry, closed." I hung it on one of the pumps. Then I headed straight for the caravan. I was too tired to undress. I just flopped down on the bunk and went to sleep. More than 10 hours later, at 6:30 in the evening, I was woken up by the ambulance men bringing my father back from the hospital. They carried him into the caravan and laid him on the lower bunk. "Hello, Dad." "Hello, Danny." "How are you feeling?" "A bit woozy," he said, and dozed off almost immediately. As the ambulance men drove away, Doc Spencer arrived and went into the caravan to take a look at the patient. "He'll sleep until tomorrow morning. Then he'll wake up feeling fine." I followed the doctor out to his car. "I'm awfully glad he's home," I said. The doctor opened the car door, but he didn't get in. He looked at me very sternly and said, "When did you last eat something, Danny?" "Something to eat? Oh, well, I had..." Suddenly I realized how long it had been. I hadn't eaten anything since I'd had supper with my father the night before. That was nearly 24 hours ago. Doc Spencer reached into the car and came out with something huge and round wrapped up in greaseproof paper. "My wife asked me to give you this." He pushed the package towards me. Then he jumped into his car and drove quickly away. I stood there clasping the big round thing tightly in my hands. After a while I turned and walked back up the steps into the caravan with my precious parcel. I placed it in the centre of the table, and very carefully I began to unwrap the greaseproof paper. I saw before me the most enormous and beautiful pie in the world. It was covered all over, top, sides and bottom, with a rich golden pastry. I took a knife from beside the sink and cut out a wedge. It was a cold meat pie. The meat was pink and tender, with no fat or gristle in it, and there were hard-boiled eggs buried like treasures in several different places. The taste was absolutely fabulous. The next morning, a Monday, my father was up at 6 o'clock. He started hobbling round the caravan to test his leg. "It hardly hurts at all. I can walk you to school." "No, it's 2 miles each way. Don't do it, Dad, please." So that day I went to school alone. But he insisted on coming with me the next day. I couldn't stop him. He walked a bit stiff-legged, but he moved as fast as ever, and the metal thing went clink on the road each time he put it down. And so life at the filling station returned as normal. Or anyway, nearly to normal. I say nearly because things were definitely not quite the same as they had been before. The difference lay in my father. A change had come over him. It wasn't a big change, but now and again I would see him standing alone, gazing up the road in the direction of Hazel's Wood. I knew that sooner or later he would tell me what the trouble was. I hadn't long to wait. About 10 days after his return from hospital, the two of us were sitting out on the platform of the caravan, watching the sun go down behind the big trees on the top of the hill across the valley. "You know what makes me so hopping mad?" my father said to me all of a sudden. "I get up in the mornings feeling pretty good. Then about 9 o'clock every single day of the week, that huge silver Rolls-Royce comes swishing past the filling station, and I see that big bloated face of Mr. Victor Hazel behind the wheel. And as he passes by, I see a sneer under his nose and a smug little smirk around his mouth, and although I only see him for 3 seconds, It makes me madder than mackerel." "I don't blame you," I said. A silence fell upon us. "I'll tell you something interesting," he said at last. "The shooting season for pheasants starts on Saturday. It always starts on the 1st of October. And every year, Mr. Hazel celebrates the occasion by giving a grand opening day shooting party." "Do lots of people come?" "Hundreds," he said. "Dukes and lords, barons and baronets, wealthy businessmen, and all the fancy folk in the county. They come with their guns and their dogs and their wives, and all day long the noise of shooting rolls across the valley. But they don't come because they like Mr. Hazel. Secretly, they all despise him." "Then why do they come, Dad?" "Because it's the best pheasant shoot in the south of England. But to Mr. Hazel, it is the greatest day in the year, and he's willing to pay almost anything to make it a success. He spends a fortune on those pheasants. Each summer, he buys hundreds of young birds from the pheasant farm and puts them in the wood where the keepers feed them and guard them. Do you know, Danny, that the cost of rearing and keeping one single pheasant up to the time when it's ready to be shot is equal to the price of 100 loaves of bread?" "It's not true." "I swear it. But to Mr. Hazel, it's worth every penny of it. And you know why? It makes him feel important. But listen, Danny, I want to tell you what I would dearly love to do right now." Here it comes, I thought. It's a deadly secret, Danny. He paused and then leaned close to me. "I would like," he whispered, "to find a way of poaching so many pheasants from Hazel's Wood that there wouldn't be any left for the big opening day shoot on October the 1st. "Dad, no. Shh, listen. If I could find a way of knocking off a couple of 100 birds all in one go." 200 is impossible. Just imagine, Danny, what a glorious victory that would be. All the dukes and lords and famous men would arrive in their big cars, and Mr. Hazel would strut about like a peacock welcoming them and saying things like, "Plenty of birds out there for you this year, Lord Thistlethwaite." And lo and behold, there wouldn't be a single pheasant to be found anywhere. And Mr. Victor Hazel's face would be redder than a boiled beetroot. But how could it be done? There's no way, Dad. It's hard enough just getting 2 birds up in those woods, let alone 200. I know that. It's the keepers that make it so difficult. There are 3 of them, and they're always around. Do they stay right through the night? No, not through the night. They go off home as soon as all the pheasants are safely up in the trees roosting. But nobody's ever discovered a way of poaching a roosting pheasant. Come on, it's about your bedtime. Off you go, and I'll come in and tell you a story. 5 minutes later, I was lying on my bunk in my pajamas. My father came in and lit the oil lamp hanging from the ceiling. It was getting dark earlier now. "All right," he said. "What sort of a story shall we have tonight?" "Dad, I just had a bit of an idea." "Go on." "You know that bottle of sleeping pills Doc Spencer gave you when you came back from hospital?" "Yes, don't like the things." "I know, but is there any reason why those wouldn't work on a pheasant?" My father shook his head sadly from side to side. "It's no use, Danny. No pheasant in the world is going to swallow those lousy red capsules." "You're forgetting the raisins, Dad." "Well, what's that got to do with it?" "Well, listen. We take a raisin. We soak it till it swells. Then we make a tiny slit in one side of it with a razor blade. Then we hollow it out a little. Then we open up one of your red capsules and pour all the powder into the raisin. Then we get a needle and thread, and very carefully we sew up the slit." Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my father's mouth slowly beginning to open. "We have a nice, clean-looking raisin chock full of sleeping pill powder. And that ought to be enough to put any pheasant to sleep." My father was staring at me. "Oh, my darling boy," he said softly. "I do believe you've got it." He was suddenly so choked up with excitement that for a few seconds he couldn't say any more. He came and sat on the edge of my bunk. "You really think it would work?" I asked him. Yes, he said quietly. It'll work all right. With this method, we could prepare 200 raisins, and all we'd have to do is to scatter them round the feeding grounds at sunset, and then walk away. Half an hour later, after it was dark and the keepers had all gone home, we would go back into the wood, and the pheasants would be up in the trees by then, roasting, and then the pheasants would be starting to feel groggy, and soon every pheasant that had eaten one single raisin would topple over unconscious and fall to the ground. And all we'd have to do is walk round picking them up. Dad, you will let me come with you. Danny, my love, if this thing works, it will revolutionize poaching. Yes, Dad, but can I come with you? Come with me, he said, floating out of his dream at last. But, my dear boy, of course you can come with me. It's your idea. You must be there. Now, where are those pills? The small bottle of red capsules was standing beside the sink. He fetched it and unscrewed the top and poured the capsules onto my blanket. Let's count them, he said. We counted them together. There were exactly 50. That's not enough. Then he cried out, Wait, there's no problem. He began carefully putting the capsules back into the bottle. All we got to do, Danny, is divide the powder from one capsule among 4 raisins. That way we'll have enough to fill 200 raisins. But would a quarter of one of those pills be strong enough? Of course it would, my dear boy. Work it out for yourself. How much smaller is a pheasant than a man? Many, many times smaller. There you are, then. If one pill is enough to put a fully grown man to sleep, you'll only need a tiny bit of that for a pheasant. But, Dad, 200 raisins aren't going to get you 200 pheasants. The greediest birds will gobble up about 10 raisins each. You got a point there. But somehow, I don't think it'll happen that way. Not if I'm very careful and spread them out over a wide area. Don't you worry about it, Danny. I'm sure I can work it. And you promise I can come with you? Absolutely. And we shall call this method the Sleeping Beauty. But we must keep very calm from now on. We must make our plans very, very carefully. Today is Wednesday. The shooting party is next Saturday. Cripes, that's in 3 days' time. When do you and I go up to the wood and do the job? The night before, on the Friday. In that way, they won't discover that all the pheasants have disappeared until it's too late. Friday's the day after tomorrow. My father stood up and began pacing the floor. Here's the plan of action. Listen carefully. Tomorrow is Thursday. When I walk you to the school, I shall go into Cooper's stores in the village and buy 2 packets of seedless raisins. And in the evening, we'll put the raisins in to soak for the night. But that only gives us Friday to get ready 200 raisins. Each one will have to be cut open and filled with powder and sewed up again. And I'll be at school all day. No, you won't. You'll be suffering from a very nasty cold on Friday, and I shall be forced to keep you home from school. Hooray! We will not open the filling station at all on Friday. Instead, we'll shut ourselves in here and prepare the raisins. And that evening, off we'll go, up the road towards the wood, to do the job. The next day was Thursday. And before we set out for the walk to my school, I went around behind the caravan and picked 2 apples from our tree, one for my father and one for me. At 8 o'clock, we started walking down the road towards my school, in the pale autumn sunshine, munching our apples. Have you brought money to buy the raisins? I said. My father put a hand in his trouser pocket and made the coins jingle. Will Cooper's be open so early? Yes, they open at 8:30. I really loved those morning walks to school with my father. We talked practically the whole time. Mostly it was he who talked and I who listened, and just about everything he said was fascinating. He was a true countryman. We parted at the school gates, and my father went off to buy the raisins. Other children were streaming in through the gates and heading up the path to the front door of the school, and I joined them. Ours was just a small village school. There were about 60 boys and girls in it, and their ages went from 5 to 11. We had 4 classrooms and 4 teachers. Miss Birdseye taught the kindergarten, the 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds, and she was a really nice person. She used to keep a bag of aniseed balls in the drawer of her desk, and anyone who did good work would be given 1 aniseed ball to suck. The 7- and 8-year-olds were taught by Mr. Corrado, and he was also a decent person. He was a very old teacher, probably 60 or more, but that didn't seem to stop him being in love with Miss Birdseye. We knew he was in love with her, because he always gave her the best bits of meat at lunch when it was his turn to do the serving. A teacher called Captain Lancaster took the 9- and 10-year-olds, and this year that included me. Captain Lancaster, sometimes known as Lankers, was a horrid man. He had fiery carrot-coloured hair and a little clipped carroty moustache and a fiery temper. He had been a captain in the army during the war against Hitler, and that was why he still called himself Captain Lancaster, instead of just plain Mr. Mr. Snoddy, our headmaster, took the top form, the 11-year-olds, and everybody liked him. He was a small, round man with a huge scarlet nose. I felt sorry for him. The nose was so big and inflamed, it looked as though it might explode at any moment and blow him up. Something horrible happened on that Thursday morning. We were having our first lesson of the day with Captain Lancaster, and he had set us a whole bunch of multiplication sums to work out in our exercise books. I was sitting next to Sidney Morgan in the back row, and we were both slogging away. Captain Lancaster sat up front at his desk, gazing suspiciously round the class with his watery blue eyes. Sidney Morgan covered his mouth with his hand and whispered very softly at me, "What are 8 9s?" "72, I whispered back. Captain Lancaster's finger shot out like a bullet and pointed straight at my face. "You!" he shouted. "Stand up!" "Me, sir?" "Yes, you blithering idiot!" I stood up. "You were talking. What were you saying? Out with it!" I stood still and said nothing. "Are you refusing to answer me?" he shouted. "Please, sir," Sidney said. "It was my fault. I asked him a question." "Oh, you did you? Stand up." Sidney stood up beside me. "And what exactly did you ask him?" "I asked him what are 8 9s, Sidney said. "And I suppose you answered him?" "Yes, sir." "So you were cheating," he said. "You may be permitted to cheat and lie and swindle in your own homes, but I will not put up with it here." At this point, a sort of blind fury took hold of me, and I shouted back at him, "I am not a cheat!" "You are not only a cheat, but you are insolent," he said quietly. "Come up here, both of you." As I stepped out from my desk and began walking up towards the front of the class, I knew exactly what was going to happen. I'd seen it happen to others many times, but up until now it had never happened to me. Each time I'd seen it, it had made me feel quite sick inside. Captain Lancaster reached up to the topmost shelf of the bookcase and brought down the dreaded cane. It was white, this cane, as white as bone, and very long and very thin, with one end bent over into a handle, like a walking stick. "You first," he said, pointing at me with the cane. "Hold out your left hand." It was almost impossible to believe that this man was able to injure me physically and in cold blood. The long white cane went up high in the air and came down on my hand with a crack like a rifle going off. Never had I felt a pain such as that in my whole life. I remember grabbing my injured left hand with my right hand and ramming it between my legs and squeezing my legs together against it. I managed not to cry out loud, but I couldn't help the tears from pouring down my cheeks. From somewhere nearby, I heard another fearful swish, crack, and I knew that poor Sidney had just got it as well. "Go and sit down, both of you." We stumbled back to our desks and sat down. "Now, let us have no more cheating." When I got home from school that afternoon, my father was in his workshop. "I bought the raisins. We will now put them in to soak. Fetch me a bowl of water, Danny." I went over to the caravan and got a bowl and half filled it with water. I carried it to the workshop and put it on the bench. "Open up the packets and tip them all in," my father said. This was one of the really nice things about my father. He didn't take over and want to do everything himself. He always let me go ahead and do it myself, while he watched and stood ready to help. He was watching me now as I opened the first packet of raisins. "Hey!" he cried, grabbing my left wrist. "What's happened to your hand?" "It's nothing." He made me open it up. The long scarlet mark lay across my palm like a burn. "Who did it?" he shouted. Was it Captain Lancaster? Yes, Dad, but it's nothing. What happened? He was gripping my wrist so hard it almost hurt. Tell me exactly what happened. I told him everything. He stood there holding my wrist, his face going whiter and whiter. I'll kill him, he softly whispered. I swear I'll kill him. His eyes were blazing. I'd never seen him look like that before. Forget it, Dad. I will not forget it. You did nothing wrong, and he had absolutely no right to do this to you. So he called you a cheat, did he? I nodded. He'd taken his jacket from the peg on the wall and was putting it on. Where are you going? I am going straight to Captain Lancaster's house, and I'm going to beat the daylights out of him. No, I cried, catching hold of his arm. Don't do it, Dad, please. I've got to. No, it'll only make it worse. Please forget it. He hesitated then. He was silent. I could see the rush of anger slowly draining out of his face. It's revolting, he said. I bet they did it when you were at school. Of course they did. And I bet your dad didn't go rushing off to beat the daylights out of the teacher who did it. He looked at me, but kept quiet. He didn't, did he, Dad? No, Danny, he didn't. I let go of his arm and helped him off with his jacket and hung it back on the peg. I'm going to put the raisins in now. And don't forget that tomorrow I have a nasty cold and I won't be going to school. Yes, that's right. We got 200 raisins to fill. Ah, so we have. I hope we get them done in time. Does it still hurt, that hand? No, not one bit. I think that satisfied him. And although I saw him glancing occasionally at my palm during the rest of the afternoon and evening, he never mentioned the subject again. That night, he didn't tell me a story. He sat on the edge of my bunk, and we talked about what was going to happen the next day up in Hazel's Wood. We were so steamed up and excited, it took a long time before we eventually fell asleep. When my father woke me at 6 o'clock next morning, I knew at once that this was the day of days. It was the day I longed for, and the day I dreaded. It was also the day of butterflies in the stomach, except that they were worse than butterflies, they were snakes. The first thing I did after I got dressed was to hang the sorry closed notice on one of the pumps. We had a quick breakfast, and then the two of us sat down together at the table in the caravan to prepare the raisins. They were plump and soft and swollen from being soaked in water, and when you nicked them with a razor blade, the skin sprang open and the jelly stuff inside squeezed out as easily as you could wish. I slit the raisins while my father opened the capsules. He opened only one at a time and poured the white powder onto a piece of paper. Then he divided it into 4 tiny piles with the blade of a knife. Each pile was carefully scooped up and put into a single raisin. A needle and black cotton finished the job. The sewing up was the hardest part, and my father did most of that. It took about 2 minutes to do one raisin from start to finish. It was fun. Your mother was wonderful at sewing things. She'd have had these raisins done in no time. I didn't say anything. I never knew quite what to say when he talked about my mother. Did you know she used to make all my clothes herself, Danny? Even socks and sweaters? Yes, but those were knitted. I would sit here in the evening watching her, and she used to talk about the children she was going to have. I shall have 3 children, a boy for you, a girl for me, and one for good measure. There was a short silence after that. Then I said, when Mum was here, Dad, did you go out very often at night? Or was it only now and then? You mean poaching? Yes. Often, at least twice a week. Didn't she mind? Mind? Of course she didn't mind. She came with me. She didn't. She certainly did. She came with me every single time just before you were born. She had to stop then. She said she couldn't run fast enough. I thought about this extraordinary piece of news. Was the only reason she went because she loved you, Dad? Or did she go because she loved poaching? Both. I was beginning to realize what an immense sorrow it must have been to him when she died. Weren't you afraid she might get shot up? Yes, Danny, I was. But it was marvelous to have her along. By midday, We had prepared 136 raisins. "We're in good shape," my father said. "Let's break for lunch." He opened a tin of baked beans and heated them up in a saucepan over the paraffin burner. I cut 2 slices of brown bread and put them on plates. My father spooned the hot baked beans over the bread, and we carried our plates outside and sat down with our legs dangling over the platform of the caravan. Usually I love baked beans on bread, but today I couldn't eat a thing. "What's the matter?" my father asked. "I'm not hungry." "Don't worry. The same thing happened to me the first time I went out. I was about your age then, maybe a little older. And in those days we always had a hot tea in the kitchen at 5 o'clock. I can remember exactly what was on the table that evening. It was my favourite thing of all. Toad in the hole. Fantastic it was. But on that day, my stomach was so jumpy I couldn't eat one mouthful." "My stomach's full of snakes." "Mine didn't feel exactly normal either. But then, this isn't a normal operation, is it? This is the most colossal and extraordinary poaching job anyone has ever been on in the history of the world." "But don't go on about it, Dad. It only makes me more jumpy. What time do we leave here?" "I worked that out. We must enter the wood 15 minutes before sunset." "When is sunset?" "Right now it's about 7:30. So we must arrive at 7:15 exactly. It's an hour and a half's walk to the wood, so we must leave here at 5:45. "Then we better finish those raisins. We've still got more than 60 to do." We finished the raisins with about 2 hours to spare. They lay in a pile on the white plate in the middle of the table. "Don't they look marvellous?" my father said. "Those pheasants are going to absolutely love them." After that, we messed around in the workshop until 5:30. Then my father said, "That's it. It's time to get ready. We leave in 15 minutes. In 10 minutes, my father came out of the caravan wearing the old navy blue sweater and the brown cloth cap with the peak pulled down low over his eyes. "What's under there, Dad?" I asked, seeing the bulge in his waistline. He pulled up his sweater and showed me 2 thin but very large white cotton sacks. They were bound neat and tidy around his belly. "To carry the stuff," he said darkly. "Aha." "Go and put on your sweater. It's brown, isn't it?" "Yes," I said. "That'll do. But take off those white sneakers. Wear your black shoes instead." I went into the caravan and changed my shoes and put on my sweater. When I came out again, my father was standing by the pumps, squinting anxiously up at the sun, which was now only the width of a man's hand above the line of trees along the crest of the ridge on the far side of the valley. "I'm ready, Dad." "Good boy. Off we go. Have you got the raisins?" "In here," he said, tapping his trouser pocket, where yet another bulge was showing. "I put them all in one bag." It was a calm, sunny evening, with little wisps of brilliant white cloud hanging motionless in the sky, and the valley was cool and very quiet as the 2 of us began walking together along the road. The iron thing underneath my father's foot made a noise like a hammer striking a nail each time it hit the road. "This is it, Danny. How'd you feel?" "Terrific," I said. And I meant it. For although the snakes were still wiggling in my stomach, I wouldn't have swapped places with the King of Arabia at that moment. "How dark will it be in there when we arrive?" "Not too dark," he said. "Quite light, in fact." "Then how do we stop the keepers from seeing us?" "That's the fun of the whole thing. It's the greatest game of hide-and-seek in the world." "You mean because they've got guns?" "Well, that does add a bit of flavour to it." We didn't talk much after that. But as we got closer and closer to the wood, I could see my father becoming more and more twitchy. He would get hold of some awful old tune, and instead of using the words, he would go, "Tum-to-lium, tum-tum-tum-tum," over and over again. When he got tired of that, he said to me, "I'll tell you something interesting about pheasants, Danny. The law says they're wild birds, so they only belong to you when they're on your own land. So, if one of Mr. Hazel's pheasants flew over and perched on our filling station, it would belong to us. You mean even if Mr. Hazel had bought it and reared it in his own wood? Absolutely. Once it flies off his own land, he's lost it. It's the same with all game. Hare, deer, partridge, grouse. We'd been walking steadily for about an hour and a quarter, and we were coming to the gap in the hedge where the cart track led up the hill to the big wood where the pheasants lived. We crossed over the road and went through the gap. We walked on up the cart track, and when we reached the crest of the hill, we could see the wood ahead of us, huge and dark, with the sun going down behind the trees and little sparks of gold shining through. No talking, Danny, once we're inside. Keep very close to me and try not to go snapping any branches. 5 minutes later, we were there. The wood skirted the edge of the track on the right-hand side with only the hedge between it and us. "Come on," my father said. "In we go." He slipped through the hedge on all fours, and I followed. It was cool and murky inside the wood. No sunlight came in at all. My father took me by the hand, and together we started walking forward. I was very grateful to him for holding my hand. My father was very tense. He was picking his feet up high and putting them down gently on the brown leaves. Kept his head moving all the time, the eyes sweeping slowly from side to side. We went on like this for maybe 4 or 5 minutes, going slowly deeper and deeper into the wood. Then a large patch of sky appeared ahead of us in the roof of the forest, and I knew that this must be the clearing. My father had told me that the clearing was the place where the young birds were introduced into the wood in early July, where they were fed and watered and guarded by the keepers, and where many of them stayed from force of habit until the shooting began. "There's always plenty of pheasants in the clearing," my father had said. "And keepers, Dad?" "Yes," he'd said. "But there's thick bushes all around, and that helps." The clearing was about 100 yards ahead of us. We stopped behind a big tree, while my father let his eyes travel very slowly all around. "We're going to have to crawl the next bit," he whispered, letting go of my hand. "Keep close behind me, and do exactly as I do." Off we go, then. My father got down on his hands and knees and started crawling. I followed. He moved surprisingly fast on all fours, and I had quite a job to keep up with him. Every few seconds he would glance back at me to see if I was all right. We crawled on, and then at last we were kneeling safely behind a big clump of bushes, right on the edge of the clearing. My father was nudging me with his elbow and pointing through the branches at the pheasants. The place was absolutely stiff with them. There must have been at least 200 huge birds strutting around. "You see what I mean?" he whispered. It was a fantastic sight, a poacher's dream come true, and how close they were. Some of them were not 10 paces from where we knelt. I glanced at my father. His face was transfixed in ecstasy. "There's a keeper," he said softly. I froze. At first I didn't even dare to look. "Over there," my father whispered. I mustn't move, I told myself, not even my head. "Look carefully," my father whispered. "Over the other side, by that big tree." Slowly, I swiveled my eyeballs in the direction he indicated. Then I saw him. "Dad," I whispered. "Don't move now, Danny. Stay well down. It's all right. He can't see us." We crouched close to the ground, watching the keeper. He was a smallish man with a cap on his head and a big double-barreled shotgun under his arm. He never moved. His face was shadowed by the peak of his cap, but it seemed to me that he was looking straight at us. "Should we go, Dad?" "Hush." Slowly, never taking his eyes from the keeper, he reached into his pocket and brought out a single raisin. He placed it in the palm of his right hand, and then, quickly, with a little flick of the wrist, he threw the raisin high into the air. I watched as it went sailing over the bushes, and I saw it land within a yard of 2 hen birds. Both birds turned their heads sharply at the drop of the raisin. Then one of them hopped over and made a quick peck at the ground, and that must have been it. I looked at the keeper. He hadn't moved. I could feel a trickle of cold sweat running down one side of my forehead and across my cheek. I didn't dare lift a hand to wipe it away. My father threw a second raisin into the clearing, then a third, and a fourth, and a fifth. It takes guts to do that, I thought. If I'd been alone, I would never have stayed there for 1 second. But my father was in a sort of poacher's trance. For him, this was it. This was the moment of danger, the biggest thrill of all. He kept on throwing the raisins into the clearing, swiftly, silently, one at a time. Then, all at once, I saw the keeper turn away his head to inspect the wood behind him. My father saw it too. Quick as a flash, he pulled the bag of raisins out of his pocket and tipped the whole lot into the palm of his right hand. "Dad," I whispered, "don't!" But with a great sweep of the arm, he flung the entire handful way over the bushes into the clearing. They fell with a soft little patter, like raindrops on dry leaves, and every single pheasant in the place must have heard them fall. There was a flurry of wings and a rush to find the treasure. The keeper's head flicked round as though there were a spring inside his neck. The birds were all pecking away madly at the raisins. The keeper took 2 quick paces forward, and for a moment I thought he was going to investigate. But then he stopped, and his face came up, and his eyes began travelling slowly round the edge of the clearing. "Lie down flat," my father whispered. "Don't move an inch." I flattened my body against the ground. "Don't you love this?" my father whispered to me. I didn't dare answer him. We lay there for what seemed like 100 years. At last I heard my father whisper, "Panic's over. Follow me, Danny, but be extra careful. He's still there." He started crawling away quickly on his hands and knees. I went after him. We went along on our hands and knees for about 100 yards. "Now run," my father said. We got to our feet and ran, and a few minutes later we came out through the hedge into the lovely open safety of the cart track. "It went marvellously," my father said, breathing heavily. His face was scarlet and glowing with triumph. "Did the keeper see us?" I asked. "Not on your life. And in a few minutes the sun will be going down, and the birds will all be flying up to roost, and that keeper will be sloping off home to his supper. Then all we got to do is go back in again and help ourselves." He sat down on the grassy bank below the hedge. I sat down close to him. He put an arm round my shoulders and gave me a hug. "You did well, Danny. I'm right proud of you." We sat on the grassy bank below the hedge, waiting for darkness to fall. "You could offer me anywhere in the world at this moment," my father said, "and I wouldn't go." His whole face was glowing with happiness. "We did it, Danny. We pulled it off. Doesn't that make you feel good?" "Terrific. But it was a bit scary while it lasted." "Ah, but that's what poaching's all about. It scares the pants off us. That's why we love it. Look, there's a hawk." I looked where he was pointing and saw a kestrel hawk hovering superbly in the darkening sky above the ploughed field across the track. "It's his last chance for supper tonight," my father said. "He'd be lucky if he sees anything now." "How long does a sleeping pill take to work?" "I don't know the answer to that one," my father said. "I imagine it's about half an hour." "It might be different with pheasants, though, Dad." "It might. We gotta wait a while anyway to give the keepers time to go home. They'll be off as soon as it gets dark. I brought an apple for each of us," he added, fishing into one of his pockets. We sat there munching away. "Look out," he whispered sharply. "There's someone coming." End of Side 2. Side 3. The man had appeared suddenly and silently out of the dusk, and was quite close before my father saw him. "It's another keeper," he whispered. "Just sit tight and don't say a word." We both watched the keeper as he came down the track towards us. He had a shotgun under his arm, and there was a black Labrador walking at his heel. He stopped when he was a few paces away. "Good evening," my father said, nice and friendly. This one was a tall, bony man with a hard eye and a hard cheek and hard, dangerous hands. "I know you," he said, coming closer. "I know the both of you." My father didn't answer this. "You're from the filling station. That's your boy. And you live in that filthy old caravan, right?" "What are we playing?" my father said. 20 questions? The keeper spat out a big gob of spit. "Beat it. Go on. Get out." "This happens to be a public footpath," my father said. "Kindly do not molest us." The keeper shifted the gun from his left arm to his right. "You're loitering with intent to commit a nuisance. I could run you in for that." "No, you couldn't," my father said. All this made me rather nervous. "I see you broke your foot," the keeper said. "You didn't by any chance fall into a hole in the ground, did you?" "It's been a nice walk, Danny," my father said, putting a hand on my knee, "but it's time we went home for our supper." He stood up, and so did I. We wandered off down the track the way we'd come, leaving the keeper standing there, and soon he was out of sight in the half-darkness behind us. "That's the head keeper," my father said. "His name is Rabbits." "Do we have to go home, Dad?" "Home? We're just beginning. Come in here." There was a gate on our right, leading into a field, and we climbed over it and sat down behind the hedge. "Mr. Rabbits is also due for his supper," my father said. "You mustn't worry about him." We sat quietly behind the hedge, waiting for the keeper to walk past us on his way home. A few stars were showing, and a bright three-quarter moon was coming up over the hills behind us in the east. "We have to be careful of that dog," my father said. "When they come by, hold your breath and don't move a muscle." "Won't the dog smell us out anyway?" "No, there's no wind to carry the scent. Look out, here they come. Don't move." The keeper came loping softly down the track, with the dog padding quick and soft-footed at his heel. I took a deep breath and held it as they went by. When they were some distance away, my father stood up and said, "It's all clear. He won't be coming back tonight." "Are you sure?" "I'm positive, Danny." "What about the other one, the one in the clearing?" "He'll be gone too." "Mightn't one of them be waiting for us at the bottom of the track, by the gap in the hedge?" "There wouldn't be any point in him doing that. There's at least 20 different ways of reaching the road when you come out of Hazel's Wood. Mr. Rabbits knows that." The three-quarter moon was well above the hills now, and the sky was filled with stars as we climbed back over the gate and began walking up the track towards the wood. It was not as dark as I had expected it to be inside the wood this time. Little glints and glimmers from the brilliant moon outside shone through the leaves and gave the place a cold, eerie look. "I brought a light for each of us," my father said. "We're going to need it later on." He handed me one of those small pocket torches shaped like a fountain pen. I switched mine on. It threw a long, narrow beam of surprising brightness, and when I moved it around, it was like waving a very long white wand among the trees. I switched it off. We started walking back towards the clearing, where the pheasants had eaten the raisins. "This," my father said, "will be the first time in the history of the world that anyone has ever tried to poach roosting pheasants. Isn't it marvellous, though, to be able to walk around without worrying about keepers?" "You don't think Mr. Rabbits might have sneaked back?" "Never," my father said. I couldn't help feeling that if I had been Mr. Rabbits, and if I had seen two suspicious-looking characters lurking just outside my precious pheasant wood, I certainly would not have gone home to my supper. Hand in hand, we threaded our way through the trees. In a few minutes, we were at the clearing. "Here's where we threw the raisins," my father said. I peered through the bushes. "What do we do?" I asked. "We stay here and wait." "Are they all roosting, Dad?" "Yes, they're all around us. They don't go far." "Could I see them if I shone my light up into the branches?" "No, they go up pretty high, and they hide in among the leaves." We stood waiting for something to happen. Nothing happened. Danny